In the next 2 episodes, we'll visit 2 gods who the ancient Romans themselves acknowledged as some of their very earliest local divinities, and indeed they have a very archaic air about them, and something of an old lost world lingers in them. These are deities who take us right back into the imagined prehistory of the ancient city, back to the very origins of Rome and its people, and so back into the thickets and undergrowth of religion in a world not yet tamed, neither predictable nor quite so civilized, a world in which raw nature still crackled and hummed. Just as in the previous episode, where we found ourselves in the realm of Silvanus, the lord of the trees and the old forest father, so in this episode we remain in the numinous wild woods. In the shape-shifting shadows of Roman religious sensibilities, and in the immense ambivalent presence of divine wilderness, these were 2 formative gods that were always lurking. Though we may not now give them much thought nor factor them into our vision of ancient Roman religion, for Roman society itself they were an intrinsic part not only of its origins, but of its being, its character and sense of identity. Long into the empire, as history rolled on and the entire Mediterranean world submitted to Roman governance, these 2 rustic gods followed, with the thumping of cloven hoofs, sudden wing swoops overhead, and the sound of distant tapping. They recalled another time and a world of half-remembered things. They conjured nostalgia sometimes, and other times they invoked dread and fear. They were deities that flitted about the edges of waking consciousness, and they haunted dreams. They are often mentioned together in the ancient sources, and they were also bound, in myth at least, by familial, generational ties, but they are nonetheless 2 distinct and very different deities, and so we will consider them separately. Originally, I'd intended to put them together in one episode, but I realized that that would be a very long episode and I didn't want to presume too much upon your time, and so in the end I've decided to split them in 2, as they deserve, and this will be a story in 2 halves. A story of wolves and woodpeckers, of woodland creatures, part man, part goat, a story of gods and kings, prophecies and peonies, civilization, chaos, and the endlessly beguiling song of the wilderness. So come, let us follow the rustling in the branches ahead. We must chase those fleeting glimpses of figures flitting amongst the trees and track down the source of that tap-tapping in the oaks. The first of these 2 deities awaits, and he has something important to say, if only you listen closely, interpret carefully. He has been here long before any of us. Come, we must consult the wisdom of the birds. Let us submit to the oracle of the forest and enter the realm of Picus. If I were to ask you what animal was intimately bound up with Rome in the ancient Roman psyche or imagination, what animal symbolized Rome and its people, you might very reasonably think of the wolf, the lupa, the legendary she-wolf that suckled the abandoned twins Romulus and Remus, who would go on to found the city that became the capital of an empire. If I narrowed the same question down to birds, though, and asked what bird symbolized Rome, you might then, again very reasonably, think of the eagle, the bird of Jupiter, the only creature capable of carrying his thunderbolt in his talons, the mighty avian guardian atop Roman military standards and emblazoned on imperial coinage, and those would be accurate and respectable answers. But I wonder, flashing across the transoms of your mind as you searched for an answer and a suitable creature, did you also catch a glimpse of a woodpecker? If you were an ancient Roman, the shape of a woodpecker would almost certainly loom large in there. This little stocky bird held an important place not only in the hearts and minds of the Roman populace, but in its history and religious landscape, because Picus was a venerable woodpecker god. The word Picus means woodpecker in Latin, and the name can be found today in the modern ornithological classifications for woodpeckers, notably the Picus viridis, otherwise known as the European green woodpecker. Some believe this specific variety of woodpecker may be the form the god Picus was imagined to take, although others argue it is the Picus martius, the woodpecker of Mars, or the black woodpecker. And I'm hesitant to attempt any firm identifications myself, partly because of the usual fuzzy lines around the edges of Roman deities generally, but partly also because this particular god was, as we'll see, a shapeshifter, and he flitted about by nature. So I'll use the word woodpecker here broadly, like the modern taxonomical classification Picidae, which is the term for the whole woodpecker family, and I use it loosely so that it includes any species an ancient person might have heard calling or hammering in the trees. I imagine they all once belonged to the realm of Picus. In Italy, woodpeckers are still frequently found in semi-open landscapes, orchards and woodland edges, especially in areas with mature deciduous trees. Even in the Lazio region around Rome, so much more urban now than it once was, they are still reasonably common in areas with mature trees. It may seem curious at first that this shy and rather unassuming little bird was a symbol of national identity. Unlike the fearsome prowling wolf or the predatory eagle, the wary woodpecker, foraging about in the trees, spends most of its time looking for ants and other insects, and hardly brings to mind great deeds and mighty power. However, if we rewind the Rome we know and the marble-clad grandeur we know it came to be, and if we go back in time to the simpler rural life of the communities that once lived among those 7 hills, it's easy to imagine that the woodpecker was once a constant companion, a creature that was usually never far off, often out of sight, but not out of earshot, with its distinctive loud call and its intermittent tap-tapping on the trunks of trees. Those sounds and that ubiquitous but elusive presence in the woods would thrum through the lives of those who lived on the edge of the woods and characterize it just as much, if not more, than the wolves that threatened livestock and the birds of prey circling above. Which is why I think the ancient Roman tradition was right, and that Picus was one of their oldest and most hallowed gods. The woodpecker might not have been an animal of choice once Rome had its bustling urban centre and foreign dominions, but it came from a past that still called out to the city's inhabitants, a past that still characterized the way they thought about the world and interacted with it, and of course, for most, rural life remained the norm. And so it was, Rome revered an ancient woodpecker god. So who was Picus? Well, it's messy, precisely because this was, even in ancient times, a very ancient god, and so he underwent countless transformations and interpretations in his own life cycle, and just like any other deity or character from classical myth and legend, there isn't one definitive answer. But to help us unpack these multiple layers and the assorted fragments that come down to us, a very good place to turn is Plutarch, the Greek thinker, writer, and historian who lived in Kyrenia in Greece during the Roman period and who spent some time in Rome itself. His most famous works are his lives, which provide historical accounts of the lives of famous Greeks and Romans like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, but for me, his most interesting work is his collection called Roman Questions, in which he asks questions about Roman culture for a Greek-speaking audience, and then he sets about trying to answer the question he posed. What I love about this is that we glean all sorts of tidbits about Roman culture and life in the Roman world that we would otherwise be completely unaware of. Even better, Plutarch doesn't decide between contesting answers to his questions. He lays out the alternatives rather than simply relating the one he thinks is best, and so we receive a better sense of the spectrum of possibilities and a fuller sense of the ancient realities. So it is with Picus. Plutarch poses the question, why do the Latins revere the woodpecker and all strictly refrain from eating it? Which is a fair question, since everything from stuffed dormice to braised flamingos might find themselves on a platter at a Roman banquet. So we learn, first of all, that alongside revering the woodpecker, there was a Roman taboo surrounding the consumption of it, which was unfamiliar to the Greeks. Plutarch provides 3 possible answers. First, he writes, is it because, as they tell the tale, Picus, transformed by his wife's magic drugs, became a woodpecker, and in that form gives oracles and prophecies to those who consult him? There's quite a lot already to unpack here. The 2 main points are that he was transformed into a woodpecker, and that in that form, if consulted, he was able to prophesy and give oracular advice. Now, the 2 don't necessarily belong together. Certainly the woodpecker was considered highly in the world of Roman divination, which relied heavily on the appearance and movement of birds and bird calls generally in its systems of augury. The woodpecker held a special place in the hierarchy of prophetic birds, as the natural historian Pliny the Elder tells us. Woodpeckers themselves have been of the first importance among auguries in Latium from the time of the king who gave his name to this bird. So Pliny reveals the woodpecker at the top of the pecking order, so to speak, in terms of his abilities to deliver divine prophetic messages. It also reveals a king by the name of Woodpecker, Picus, sometime in the hazy prehistory of Rome. Picus was usually said to be a son of Saturn, a mighty Roman god of another age entirely, lord of an achingly remote time before time. We'll meet Saturn in another episode, but what's important here is that, considered as one of his sons, Picus was therefore again positioned as a god of exceedingly great antiquity. Kings of Rome's very earliest myth history often became gods instead of taking the usual mortal route of simply dying, and this happened to the hero Aeneas and to his descendant Romulus, and so here too we see Picus, considered the earliest king of Latium, as their archetypal royal antecedent ascending from king to god. Of course, it makes better sense to have a king called Woodpecker than a king who is a woodpecker. And there's always this ambiguity of form, flip-flopping in the imagination from bird to human and back again. And one thing Roman society, and particularly Roman writers, wrestled with and tried to rationalize over the years is how his woodpecker form fit into their evolving, anthropomorphizing worldview. I imagine What's really happening is that Picus hailed from Rome's deep, archaic religious layers, which we've encountered already many times in this series. This was, as we've seen, a more animistic sense of the divine in places and of things, and in that world, steeped in divine but formless essences, noumena, or at least a world in which the divine was not conceptualized in human form, in that world, Picus may well have been king, the divine woodpecker delivering oracles from his leafy kingdom. Yet, as we've also observed in previous episodes, when some of these gods emerged into the bright lights of Roman urban culture, these amorphous nature deities often took on human bodies when temples were dedicated to them and when cult statues were required. It didn't always happen, and so far as I know, it didn't happen for Picus, who remained, in fact, the woodpecker I suspect he had always been. Some parts of Roman society, however, seem to have thought such a bird god needed an explanation, and so at some point the story seems to have come about that Picus had, in fact, once been a king in human form, but that he was transformed into a woodpecker. At some point, blame for this transformation fell upon Circe, the famous witch of Homeric legend, who had a notorious track record of turning humans into animals. She had once drugged Odysseus's crew with a mixture of cheese, meal, and honey, and turned them all into pigs. Odysseus, however, threatened her and made her turn them back again into humans, and then Odysseus ended up spending an entire year on Circe's island, living in the lap of luxury as the lover of the enchantress. In some ways, the story of Picus is the opposite of that tale. What poets like Ovid and Virgil relate is that Picus was a son of Saturn and a handsome king of Latium who had great prophetic powers, but who one fateful day spurned the love of the sorceress Circe. In Ovid's account, Picus had made many a nymph weak at the knees with his good looks. He had turned the heads of the dryads born on the hills of Latium. The nymphs of the fountains pursued him, and the naiads, those that live in the Tiber and in the river Numicius, and Anio's streams, and the brief course of the Almo, the rushing Nar, and the Farfar of dense shadows, and those who haunt the wooded pool of Scythian Diana and its neighbouring lakes. But, spurning them all, he loved one nymph alone. This was a nymph called Canens, herself a rare beauty, but rarer still was her gift of song, as Ovid goes on to describe. She could move the rocks and trees with her singing, make wild beasts gentle, halt wide rivers, and detain the wandering birds. This imagery is redolent with that animistic spirit I've just described surrounding Picus, and it makes sense that the divine bird, whose yoffling call and distant drumming drift eerily throughout the forest, would fall for a nymph who personified the song that moves rocks and holds all nature in its thrall. Together, this pair embody the soundscape of the forest. Their love is doomed, however, because Circe, the dastardly sorceress, spots the handsome Picus riding his horse through the woods, and she too takes a fancy to him. She casts her herbs about and performs some spells, but to no avail. Picus has his own powers, and his love for Canens was stronger than her incantations. He spurns her advances, saying, "While the fates guard Canens, Janus's daughter, for me, I will not harm our bond of affection by an alien love." Enraged, Circe tries again, repeatedly, but without success, as Ovid describes, repeating her entreaties time and time again in vain. Circe cried, "You will not go unpunished or return to your canons, and you will learn the truth of what the wounded, a lover, a woman can do." And Circe is a lover, is wounded, is a woman. And just as hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, Circe determines to punish him. Then, twice to the west, twice to the east, she turned, thrice touched the youth with her wand, thrice spoke an incantation. He ran, but was surprised to find himself running faster than before. He saw wings appear on his body. Angered at his sudden transformation to a strange bird in the woods of Latium, he pecked at the rough oak wood with his hard beak, and in fury wounded the long branches. The feathers of his crown and nape took on the colour of his crimson cloak, and what had been a golden brooch pinning his clothes became plumage, and his neck was surrounded by green gold. Nothing was left to Picus of his former being, except his name. It's therefore a woodpecker ever after he remained, or, as Ovid seems to suggest, a disembodied being in the forest that flits about in the vessel of woodpeckers. He maintained, however, his prophetic powers, and thus remained central to Roman practices of augury and divination. That is the tale. In the passage from Roman Questions that I read to you earlier, Plutarch said that Picus was transformed by his wife's magic drugs and became a woodpecker, which may have been a mistake on Plutarch's part, or just as easily another lost version of the story. Plutarch himself didn't seem to think that this was the real reason Romans revered woodpeckers anyway, and for what it's worth, neither do I. At least I think the idea of Picus's original human form and his subsequent transformation into a woodpecker was a retrofitting of earlier ideas to later Roman sensibilities. However, I think there is much in the telling that is still suffused with the religious atmosphere of the old ways. In the telling and retelling of the story of Picus, something of the sacred woods and wilderness carries across in the magical spells and incantations, the shape-shifting, the nymphs, the prophecies, and the songs and the sounds of the forest. The second possible answer to his question, which Plutarch seems to find more credible, is in another tale, the famous one of Romulus and Remus, or rather in a detail of that tale, which we tend to overlook today, even though it was important once. Did Romans revere woodpeckers, Plutarch asks, because when Romulus and Remus were exposed, not only did a she-wolf suckle them, but also a certain woodpecker came continually to visit them and bring them scraps of food. It's interesting, isn't it, that we always remember the she-wolf, that unforgettable surrogate who sustained the twins with her own milk, but for some reason we pay little attention to the woodpecker that fed them and watched over them. The Romans themselves never made the same oversight. That woodpecker was beloved, and this was Picus too, in the sense that this guardian sustaining Rome's founding twins in their helpless infancy was the divine ancestral woodpecker. Again, glancing over the details of the actual story, we find ourselves again in the enchanted woods, where the animals are not only the companions of the people who find themselves there at the mercy of nature, but their guardians and even their foster parents. It was a wolf and a woodpecker that were fundamental to nurturing Romulus and Remus and bringing the future city of Rome into existence. Though the addition of the woodpecker might be surprising to some, woodpeckers and wolves are not in themselves a surprising combination, since, as Plutarch himself explains, generally, even to this day, in foothills and thickly wooded places where the woodpecker is found, there also is found the wolf. In other words, they share the same habitat, and so sighting both animals in the same vicinity was normal. This environmental pairing, therefore, helps to elucidate why both the wolf and the woodpecker were animals sacred to Mars, a combination which otherwise might sound quite peculiar. While the wolf makes perfect sense, of course, to the realm of agriculture and war which Mars represents, the woodpecker is not at first such an intuitively good fit. However, it is its association with Mars that Plutarch provides as a third possible explanation as to why the woodpecker was so revered among Romans. Is it rather because they regard this bird as sacred to Mars, even as other birds to other gods? For it is a courageous and spirited bird, and has a beak so strong that it can overturn oaks by pecking them until it has reached the inmost part of the tree. Ultimately, these three alternative explanations seem in fact all interconnected. Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, so the wolf and the woodpecker as his sacred animals make them suitable foster parents of the twins. Though we might speculate further, and perhaps wonder in what form exactly Mars was supposed to have visited Rhea Silvia when she conceived Romulus and Remus. In one version of the myth, he came to her in a dream as she slept by a spring, and she woke up pregnant. But bearing in mind Jupiter's shape-shifting into animals, among other things, in his own amorous advances upon mortal woman, there's no real reason to assume that the form Mars took was human. Strange to say, then, the father of the Roman people might conceivably even have been the woodpecker. But in fact, this would not be the only woodpecker in the imagined genealogy, because Picus himself, in his own right, was thought to be an ancestor of the Roman people in a direct lineage. Picus had one child with his great love, the nymph Carnens, and this child was Faunus. And Faunus was the father of Latinus, who was the king of old Latium in the time of Aeneas. The kindly king Latinus welcomed Aeneas and his fugitive Trojans to his humble rustic kingdom, which was the site of future Rome. Latinus's daughter would marry Aeneas's son, joining the two bloodlines and beginning the long line of kings that would eventually result in the birth of Romulus and Remus. Convoluted, I know, but the upshot is that Latinus was the eponymous hero of the Latin race, from whom Romulus and Remus would eventually descend, and Picus was his grandfather. By extension, then, the Latins and the Roman people were quite literally descendants of the woodpecker. And so it makes sense that in whatever form Mars later appeared to Rhea Silvia to conceive Romulus and Remus, of course the woodpecker would be their guardian and assist the wolf in keeping the twins alive. These were not only its wards, but its kin. It had been divine woodpeckers all the way. And through the activities and efforts of this bird, the city of Rome could one day come into existence. Rome wasn't alone in this. The woodpecker gave its name to the neighbouring people of Picenum, who in legend were shown the location of their future city by a woodpecker. And now we see that Picus was the woodpecker father of Faunus, a god we glimpsed briefly in the last episode among the trees with Silvanus. Here we find him again in the woods with the birds. Next time we'll turn our focus upon him and explore his woodland world of dancing fauns, but already his wild, hoofed presence here evokes more of the same enchanted wilderness native to central Italy, and which we may now sense strongly emanating from Picus and his prophecies tapped out on tree trunks. So, what did all this look like in a practical sense? Well, we know that there was a very ancient oracle of Mars located in a place called Tiora Matiene, which is thought to be somewhere in the Sabine territory northeast of Rome, although its location is still undetermined. But at this sacred site, which had itself originally been selected by reading the signs from woodpeckers, there was a sacred wooden pillar upon which, as Dionysius of Halicarnassus recounts, a heaven-sent bird, which they call Picus, appears and gives prophecies. This bird was the destination of pilgrimage and could be consulted for oracular advice. Whether or not there were other such pillars and specific oracle sites, we are left to wonder. However, the bird itself was thought generally to deliver prophecies. Many of these were probably personal, as people interpreted when the woodpecker spoke and what it said in personal contexts related to their own lives, just as they did presumably when visiting the famous woodpecker at the Oracle of Mars with their questions. Sometimes incidents were of state importance, however. One famous example, Pliny the Elder says he can't refrain from recounting, as he relates. When Aelius Tubero, city praetor, was giving judgments from the bench in the forum, a woodpecker perched on his head so fearlessly that he was able to catch it in his hand. In reply to inquiry, the seers declared that disaster was portended to the empire if the bird were released, but to the praetor if it were killed. Tubero, therefore, at once tore the bird in pieces, and not long afterwards he fulfilled the portent. Pliny isn't interested in expounding the moral of the tale. It's clear that Aelius Tubero, soon after ripping the woodpecker apart, suffered some sort of personal disaster, and for Pliny this is simply excellent evidence of an accurate oracle delivered by a woodpecker. Although it must be said that things didn't turn out so great for the woodpecker either. Another writer, Valerius Maximus, provides more details of the anecdote. In his version, Tubero didn't rip the bird up with his hands, but with his teeth, apparently biting its head off. Presumably, he was taking the hit and sacrificing himself for the greater good. But what happened shortly thereafter, according to Valerius Maximus, is that the Aelian family lost 17 exceptionally brave men in the Battle of Cannae, one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Nevertheless, as Valerius Maximus also relates, although a large chunk of the finest from the Aelian family were wiped out in one fell swoop, the Republic itself went on to rise to the topmost pinnacle of empire. The woodpecker had prophesied truly. We'll meet Picus again next time and hear about some more of his prophetic episodes in relation to Faunus, and think about what these two gods together might tell us about the thought worlds of Roman religion. But for now we'll leave him tap-tapping again in the trees. Plutarch, as we heard, called him a courageous and spirited bird, and for this reason he saw it as a bird worthy of Mars and temperament. But since Mars was the father of the nation, in turn it was a bird worthy also of the Roman people. And surely the Roman populace saw something of themselves in this hard-headed, resilient little creature. In their persistence and tenacity, just as the beak of the woodpecker could eventually topple trees, so too they, even if they didn't win the battle, they would eventually win the war. That mighty beak, like a battering ram, surely reminded them of their own military tactics. And although I know of no ancient source that makes the comparison, I can't help but think that the flash of red on the head, common to all woodpeckers, was surely reminiscent of the red crests of a Roman military helmet. So somehow, alongside the wolf and the eagle, those renowned predators so famously symbolic of the Roman state, this tenacious and spirited little bird is equally representative of its people, their character and outlook. And somehow, from the earliest times and long-distant ages to the height of empire, from the heart of Rome to the battering frontiers, from prophecies to progenies, and from the woods and wilderness to kingship and civilization, Picus, the woodpecker, abides.